Involvement with the criminal justice system is life-changing. It matters.
Having a justice system that works is a really important part of a democratic society.
I'm Penelope Gibbs, Director of Transform Justice.
I'm Rob Allen. I've worked in and around criminal justice all my career.
This is the Transform Justice podcast, throwing light on the criminal justice system.
Hearing from people who know.
It's about whether the system's fair
and what can be done to make it better.
Hello, we're going to discuss prisons today. Specifically, can and do prisons rehabilitate? Here to join us are Andrea Coomber, Chief Executive of the Howard League, and Andi Brierley, who is a Senior Lecturer in Criminology and was in prison himself as a young man. So, Rob, you've seen many prisons around the world. Do most try to rehabilitate prisoners, and which ones do it best?
Well, almost all prisons for sentenced people say they try to offer rehabilitation, but the reality is very few provide opportunities on anything like the scale that's required. So there might be some things they can point to, workshops, projects, but the only really good one I remember was in Germany, a young adult prison, and it was actually like a university campus. We went to the cells, nobody was in there during the day because they were out learning, computing, catering, metalwork, or working. It wasn't overcrowded, there were plenty of staff, there were great facilities, there were enough activity spaces for people to be able to do something they wanted to do. So it had a whole lot more investment than, sadly, we put into things in England and Wales.
And of course, in Germany, they imprison fewer people than we do per capita. Andrea, the Justice Select Committee has recently brought out a report on rehabilitation in prisons, and it's titled Ending the Cycle of Reoffending. Is that what rehabilitation is about?
I think that's what the public expects rehabilitation to be about. I think the understanding is that people will go into prison and there will be interventions, support or whatever that means that when they come out, they don't reoffend. The report basically found that the prisons are in such a dreadful state that none of it's possible, because it just sets out all of the ways that our system fails to provide people with the support that they might need. So I thought it was a good report because it sort of synthesises all of the problems in the system, but I don't know that we learn very much about rehabilitation from it.
Andi, some people dislike the word rehabilitation. Is that you? And do you understand why?
I would say the term rehabilitation means different things to different people. If you have the Justice Minister, David Lammy, stood up talking about what rehabilitation means to him, it would probably be something very different to my brother, for example, who's currently residing in prison. And then if you asked the average person in the street who pays the taxes and expects people to go to prison to be rehabilitated, you probably get a completely different answer from that individual as well. So I think it's a term that's used quite frequently and often by people who've got either agendas or biases. So it's not that I don't like the term itself. However, once you get the term rehabilitation wrapped up in institutions that try to measure it, that try to evaluate it, to try to work out how to do it on an institutional level, I believe the term rehabilitation becomes something else for somebody else. And that can cause its own problems. I mean, in the terminology that the committee used was that it doesn't deliver rehabilitation prisons at the minute. I don't think you can deliver rehabilitation. I think you create the conditions which enable people to go through the rehabilitation process. But I just don't think it's something that can be done to people. And I think, as Andrea pointed out, the politicians use it in that way because the general public don't understand that and therefore expect politicians to enact rehabilitation. And so I feel like there's a bit of a kind of a game around the concept itself, rather than just providing the conditions that are more likely to create somebody to have a non-offending life.
I agree with Andi.
I mean, Andrea, you I know you visit a lot of prisons. Have you ever been to any in this country or elsewhere where you really think, actually, they are doing a reasonable job of giving the kind of opportunities that Andi's talking about?
So the vast majority of prisons I visit are unable to do that. Not because the people who lead them don't want to do that. I think all prison governors I've met want to run a prison where they do provide those opportunities, where they provide conditions to give people who want to change, where they need to change, the opportunities to then develop and move away from crime. The only prison I've really been to which I've thought, wow, if my son was in prison, this is where I'd want him to be and I'd feel he'd stand a good chance, is Oakwood, which is a Category C prison run by G4S outside Wolverhampton. It is.
What does Category C mean?
It's the third kind of level down. It's the lowest level of security prison we have before open prison. And Oakwood happens to be the biggest prison in the country. It is also the cheapest prison in the country per head of prisoner. But it's the only prison I've been to where every single person I talked to talked about how it was the best prison they'd ever been to. They enjoyed the culture. They felt that they had opportunities. There are a lot of what they call prisoner-led initiatives there.
Like?
All kinds of things. I mean, anything that really needs to be done in the prison is done by prisoners, and prisoners put together proposals to management of things that they feel like the prison needs. So there is a wing, for example, for people on basic regime, so people who have been in trouble or have come out of the segregation unit or have been struggling. And there are lots of interventions with people about why they've been getting into fights or why they've misbehaved. And they're entirely run by men from other wings of the prison who've been trained in mediation. And I think it just works for absolutely everybody. Like it works for those people who are leading that because they are skilled up. They feel like they're contributing. It works for the people who are on the basic regime because they have people who they feel like understand them. And then that's rolled out across the prison. I mean, there's just this amazing ethos there, really low rates of violence. It's the only place I've ever been where I've asked to see a prisoner in the segregation unit and was told that I could go see them, but they weren't in the segregation unit. They're in the gardens all day because that particular person really struggles being in a cell, and they found that he's just much better suited to being outside for the day. I mean, I left with a chili plant from one of the men in the garden.
I mean, Andi, what do you think of that? I mean, it sounds very encouraging, and the question going through my mind was, if they can do it there, why can't they do it in more prisons? Have you any reflections on that?
So when I spent 15 years working in youth justice, it was all kind of done on this idea that you can manage people's risk and that you can change their thinking. So I'm trained to do that. I did it for 15 years. I think it's completely ineffective. I think it's the ethos of the prison. So I'm currently researching why people like myself who've gone through the prison system, who come back into practice, it's called peer mentors or lived experience practitioners, are so effective at building relationships. And two of my participants both said that acting as a peer mentor, somebody who help and support other people in prisons, led them to coming out of prison and wanting to do that kind of role outside in the community. So that became the intervention. It shifted their identity from somebody who's a prisoner to somebody who wants to be a helper. When I go back to my own personal experience of custody, I was in HMP Doncaster, and they gave me a working opportunity to be what they call a wing representative on the wing. And that meant that I was democratically speaking to the governors about what was going on the wing, what the prisoners wanted, what they felt wasn't working for them. I believe having the opportunity to be out of my cell and engaging in activities like that, I wouldn't say it's the causal factor, but it significantly helped me to understand that I've got more to offer society than somebody who commits crime. And if prisoners are staying behind their doors for 22 hours a day, that means that they cannot get access to the things that, I'm not saying that would rehabilitate them, but would create the conditions that enables them to get the skills that if they want to come out and stop offending, they've got all the opportunities post-prison. That's where the overcrowdedness is impacting on the ability of prisoners to get those skills, and prisons where prisoners are out of the cells getting the skills that they need to kind of come out and not offend again. They're few and far between at the moment, and that's a massive problem.
Are you saying, Andi, that there's too much emphasis on staff members in prison being able to, as it were, change the behaviour and influence the behaviour of prisoners within them, rather than setting up things like you're talking about?
Yes, here's an anecdote. I was working in a warehouse in 2006, and I'd done 4 prison sentences, and I kind of was pondering on whether I've got more to offer than a warehouse. If you want to work in a warehouse, that's fine. It was a prison officer's voice that I heard ringing in my head when I heard that Leeds Youth Justice Service wanted volunteers. And he told me that everybody loves a turnaround story. And because he had such a solid relationship with me, I heard his message in my brain, hence why I rang up Leeds Youth Justice Service and got a 15-year career working with the most deprived kids in my city. So I think when the relationships are really solid between prisoners and prison officers, it can be truly life-changing. But I'm not quite sure that the staff are getting a true understanding of the reasons people end up in prisons, and more importantly, the conditions that they need to create to help them have the skills that they can leave prison with and not get involved in crime. I think that that's lacking because they get 8-week training. I just don't think that's enough, and that is an incredible job that people are doing, and I just don't think they're getting the support to do it.
I mean, Andrea, do you think too much emphasis is put on prison staff trying to change prisoners' behaviour and thoughts, or not enough?
I mean, I think there are very few prisons where the staff have the bandwidth to even start to do that, even if that were a good thing. I mean, I always get saddened when I talk to people on landings who sort of say, you know, Miss, I've been fixed. Like there's something really wrong with them. And this is for kind of offences that, frankly, many people would commit if they were put in certain circumstances. It puts the focus on the individual and fixing that individual. I don't necessarily think it's about fixing individuals. It's more about having a society where people aren't drawn to taking those opportunities for crime where they present.
When the guy says, Miss, I've been fixed, are they referring to some programme that they've done? Sometimes they've gone to Grendon, and people who go to Grendon generally have committed pretty serious offences and have high levels of trauma, and Grendon kind of breaks them down and builds them up again. And I can spot someone who's been to Grendon pretty quickly just by the way they engage with people, and they're very quick to they recognise their triggers, and you'll sit in a group chatting over a cup of tea and they'll say, I was becoming overbearing, therefore I left. You know, like they just show a level of insight into the way they interact with people, which frankly, I think the whole of the population would benefit from. We spend a lot of time, we being the system, spends a lot of time sort of shaming people. And shame, I think, is a hugely damaging feeling. It doesn't bring out the best in people. It doesn't give them a sense of the future. It doesn't give them a sense of what they can contribute to society. And I think that the beauty of a place like Oakwood and some of these other places where they let prisoners out of their own heads and they give them the opportunity to imagine themselves in a different way. And that's not necessarily about even skills and work. It's about giving them opportunities to show that they're responsible. And none of those things happen when you're banged up in your cell for 22, 23 hours a day, or if you're choosing to self-isolate because the prison's so violent. So I think you need to find ways to combat that shame. Like, I don't think people should be behind their doors thinking about what they did. I don't think that's really helpful. I think you need to give people an opportunity to imagine themselves differently. But I'm not sure that we're giving everybody who wants to make that step change in the way they think about themselves and their life that opportunity. Andi, one of the prime things that prisons offer in order to get prisoners to think of themselves differently and to, as it were, fix them are these things called offender behaviour programmes. So they are offered in prisons, and some people, in order to even get out of prison, are forced to go for these offender behaviour programmes. Are they helping in this journey that people are going on? Did you do any, by the way?
Yeah, so I did a number of them. So I can do a compare and contrast. The Prisons Against Substance-Related Offending, I experienced that as a bit of a shaming exercise because I had 3 psychologists, similar age to me. I was about 21. They was in training. And they would often say, this is what the research says, this is what the evidence suggests. And when I went into practice, I made sure I didn't use those words because it's awful when you're on the receiving end of that. So you've read something and it's quantified that this is how I'm going to fix my life. My mum, when she fell pregnant with me, was 16 years old. She was in care. And then she had another 4 children, making 5 children before she was 25. The circumstances in which I was raised in were incredibly chaotic and traumatic. I went into care as a result of that chaos. I know through all my research now that if you don't have your needs met as a child, it can have significant impacts right throughout the lifespan. So sometimes this idea that you can change my thinking doesn't consider the kind of social conditions in which I've been raised. So that can become a shaming exercise. However, the Community Sports Leadership Award that I think really helped me build my confidence and see that I can offer more to the world than crime and addiction that I was involved in was because they gave me a whistle. So it was in Deerbolt Prison. And when I blew this whistle when everybody was playing sports, everybody would stop. And all of a sudden I became a leader in that space. And that just made me realise that actually I didn't have to be an insignificant, marginalised person in society. I could actually be a leader and I could do some constructive stuff. And all that were allowing me to do that was this whistle, this little tiny little plastic whistle. And so that built my confidence. So I'd suggest that the interventions that get people involved and proactively engaged in developing skills that they need, in my view, and the evidence would back this up, I would argue, are more effective than having someone sat down in a room with a group of people who claim to have the solutions about your life and dictate to you what they've read about in a textbook. I'm saying all of this while I work in academia, by the way, which is ironic. But each individual is an individual with their own individual circumstances, so that needs to be considered. And if you build the confidence that they can be more than where they come from, you're more likely to be effective than, I would argue, these programmes that you're pointing to in terms of offending behaviour programmes.
And can I say the government actually don't know whether they work because they have not actually tested the impact of them in the real world?
No.
I mean, Andrea, what do you make of these programmes? They obviously cover a variety of different kinds of things, as Andy has said. And no doubt some will be better than others. But are you a fan of these? Do you think there need to be more of them? Because there's been a lot of criticism that people just can't get on them.
I mean, look, I have a real problem when people can't get on them because they are required to do them for their sentence. In fact, I was at a prison with lots of IPP sentenced prisoners last week, and a number of them have been told they have to do X program at Y jail by the parole board, and 2 years later they're still waiting for a transfer to that particular jail to get on that program. And so it can be a complete, roadblock to progress and to release. So I don't like them for that. Because they've not been evaluated, a lot of them, we don't know whether they actively do help people or support people. I'll often talk to people who on wings who like doing the programs because it's a reason to get out of their cell. In some jails, you have nothing at all to do. Having a course that you can do is at least something. But I really object to them as a hoop that prisoners need to jump through in order to progress their sentence when they have not been properly independently evaluated. I just think it's extraordinary.
It is, isn't it? I think the one that frustrates and shocks me the most is a programme which was designed to reduce the likelihood of somebody committing more domestic abuse on release from prison, called Building Better Relationships. And they ran that programme in prisons and outside for over 10 years. And we still don't know whether it has any impact on domestic abuse. And we should know.
Well, I think there was an evaluation some years ago that found one of the violence reduction ones actually had the opposite effect.
It was the sex offender treatment programme. Yeah, it had a backfire effect.
Yeah.
Made it marginally more likely that you would reoffend.
Yeah.
Which is extraordinary. And again, their progression's being delayed by not doing a course that, to the extent that it's been evaluated, shows it's more likely to make you commit a sexual offence. I mean, it makes no sense at all. I mean, the new one is a course called Building Choices. That is the new general course that sort of most people are being required to do, because I'm receiving a lot of letters from people who've been told they have to do building choices, but it's not available in their jail, so they are unable to progress. And that's frustrating because it means they're not getting to a lower categorised prison, not getting as much freedom or visits, all that sort of stuff.
I mean, Andy, I guess these programs probably involve you getting out of your cell and having a session with a psychologist for an hour or 2 hours a week or something. If the rest of your experience on the landings and in the prison is one which is not pro-rehabilitation, it's not really going to work, is it? I mean, do you think that prisons are in such a state that it's not really possible that rehabilitation can happen, that desistance, which is sort of growing out of crime, can happen, or are you more optimistic?
I think there's two separate questions. Do I believe that prisons in and of themselves rehabilitate people? No, I do not. I believe that if people change their behaviour. It can be partly because they was in prison. It can be partly because they've got a relationship. It could be partly because they've decided they've had enough. It could be partly because they've come away from drugs. It's a really complex human experience. So I think it's really difficult when we try to evaluate things and attribute that to one thing. The second part, should we, while people are being sanctioned and held accountable for their behaviour, should they experience a completely humane experience that can ensure that the punishment isn't more damaging to people who've already been damaged as to why they come into the contact with the criminal justice system? And by the way, I'm in this really interesting space where I sit on a panel with the Ministry of Justice while my brother is in prison. And so I get this complexity of what the Ministry of Justice are wanting to do, and then I get a letter from my brother saying what is the reality on the prison landings. And sometimes that can be incongruent. You know, what's happening in prisons at the moment, I think, is damaging the ability for people to develop the skills that they need to not reoffend, for those that do need that. Not everybody in prison needs that. I think I seen something recently where they said like up to 50% of prison staff have got less than 2 years experience on the landing. That is incredible, because when I think about my time in custody, the best prison officers were those that can just feel the rhythm of the landing, right? It's called jailcraft. They just know that that guy's over there. He's never over there, so what's going over? And they would strategically move themselves there to try and mitigate the hyper-vigilant environment of prison. We've lost a lot of that, and that has had a massive impact on the safety of prisons. And I think that's why we've seen this increase in violence from prisoner to prisoner and prisoner to staff, because we've lost that jailcraft. So I err away cautiously from the claims of this rehabilitation as a concept being done to people. I more think about prisons should be humane spaces where people are being sanctioned by the state, and under that kind of umbrella, we are absolutely seeing a prison system at the moment that is causing more harm to people that have disproportionately been in care, disproportionately been abused and in domestic violence relations, specifically women, come from disadvantaged backgrounds, excluded from school, drug addiction, all that kind of stuff. They're getting a double whammy, aren't they? They've had all these negative experiences, then they're going into an underfunded prison system that's actually causing them more harm, and that will impact on them coming out and not reoffending, I think.
Yeah, the punishment is meant to be the deprivation of liberty. It's not living in a cell where you don't have glass on your window and so you're freezing through the winter and you've got rats and you're locked in that cell for 23 hours a day. It was intended for a small Victorian woman, and yet you're sharing it with a 6'4" man called Barry, and you're watching him, do his business on the toilet in the same space where you're eating your food. I mean, the conditions I've seen in some of the jails I've been to over the last few years, I found extraordinary. I was at Bedford Jail at the end of 2022, on the day actually that the urgent notification came out for Bedford. I took a board member of ours who'd never been to a jail before, and the first thing was to go down to the segregation unit.
Which is where prisoners are isolated either for their own safety or for disciplinary reasons.
It was an underground one, wasn't it?
It was an underground segregation unit, and the cell was on all sides covered in mould. It had cockroaches alive and dead running around. The toilet was crusted with faeces, and there was a toothbrush and a toothpaste out because it was about to have a person come down from the mental health unit who would be moving into there. There was no bedding. There was absolutely nothing in it. And the inspection report showed that when it rained, that segregation unit would flood with sewage and had been flooding with sewage for years. And every person I talked to, the opposite of Oakwood, said it was the worst jail they'd ever been into. The Howard League ended up threatening legal action against Bedford Jail about the condition of the segregation unit. It turns out it's very quick to be able to turn off the flooding of sewage problem. That's perfectly capable. And they ended up opening a new segregation unit and closing the old one through threat of litigation. But we don't have the resource, frankly, to litigate every awful equivalent of the Bedford segregation unit as a charity. There needs to be a real investment and a commitment from the government that places of incarceration are going to be places of decency. I'm not saying that we want disco balls and Pharaoh and Ball paint or luxury carpets, at all. I'm talking about spaces that are decent and safe. I mean, one of my abiding distresses is just the failure to keep people in prison safe, to keep them safe from self-harm, to keep them safe from self-inflicted death, to keep them safe from violence. I've got men writing to me, particularly at Wakefield Jail at the moment, talking about how they are segregating themselves in their cell because they're so scared after 2 murders in the last 2 months.
I mean, Andy, you mentioned earlier about your brother being in prison and hearing some of the realities from him and how these contrast with what the Ministry of Justice say. I mean, does what Andrea say, does that kind of resonate with some of these realities you hear from him?
Yeah, I mean, you have to bear in mind that he's completely been addicted to heroin since he was about 14 years old. He's never worked a day in his life. He's been to prison probably 20 times. He was abused and he's never recovered from that as a child. And yet, before Christmas, a year ago, he was living on the streets and I went to go find him. And I was trying to find him somewhere to go, somewhere like a rehab. And we just couldn't find him anywhere. 2 weeks later, he's committed a crime and he's in prison. Then he's come out with the same level of substance misuse problem that he had when he entered prison. That is just astounding. And by the way, he was out for 2 weeks. He was out for 2 weeks and then he's gone back in. If you don't even want to have a conversation on a moral level, you can have it on an economic level. This is incredibly expensive and incredibly ineffective for people who haven't got their mental health needs met. So it is a bit of a challenge, Rob, sometimes, because I'm in this really weird space where I'm kind of juggling two things on a personal level and on an institutional level. But we're certainly getting something wrong when people are going to prison and coming out with the same challenges that they had when they entered prison in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, that's basic. If you've got a very entrenched drug addiction, then the rehabilitation needs to start with that. Moving on in your life relies on getting support. And if that's not happening, then definitely the offending is likely to continue.
I mean, Anne Owers talks a lot about the answers to the prison crisis being everything that's not prison, better housing, better drug and alcohol treatment, all those things on the outside. I mean, I had a letter from a man a couple of weeks ago who said, I've been in prison for much of the last 30 years. I've most recently been homeless. I'm actually quite enjoying having a bed. It's warm. I have clothes. They get cleaned. There's some interesting people to talk to. I mean, it was just a damning indictment on society as a whole that this man feels like, he's not enjoying being in prison. He doesn't like the loss of his liberty, but that actually he is better taken care of in prison. And I have to say, one of the worst, the sort of low tier of good prisons, a very poor prison, he's actually having a better experience of that than he would if he was outside.
That is deeply sad. Andrea, the government has in Parliament at the moment a sentencing bill, which Andy mentioned in terms of it is trying to reduce the number of short prison sentences. But the government is implying that opportunities for rehabilitation will be transformed as a result of the measures in this sentencing bill. Are they right?
No. I mean, they will, for a period of time, take population out of prisons, which will hopefully give prison governors and prison management and prison staff a bit of breathing space. But if you look at the impact assessments of the bill, the space that's going to be saved is immediately going to be filled up by all the new people coming to prison. And the same is true of the 14,000 new prison places that they're building, proudly in their biggest prison building program since the Victorians. They will also be for all the new people. So for the 22,000 people who will tonight be spending the night double bunked in a cell intended for a single person, there is only going to be short-term reprieve for them. We obviously welcome the abolition of short sentences. A 2-week sentence does absolutely nothing except lose somebody their housing, their benefits and their access to their kids.
Clearly not long enough for rehabilitation of any kind, even if you believed in it.
No, I think that is the danger, that judges will decide to up tariff up to over a year, that magistrates, this is, let's remember, lay magistrates, retired dentists, retired accountants, will be deciding to put people in prison for longer, thinking that they will get rehabilitation, not recognising that they'll be spending 22 hours in their cell doing nothing. And, that's the danger. I was in the Netherlands last year, and one of the things that they've done is they have a sentence where people do go away for 2 years in order to have those interventions. And I think the jury's out as to whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But the one thing they do there is they do look at why somebody's committed an offence. And if your offending is about your problem with drugs, they don't see the point in just putting you in jail. They will address the drug addiction most often in the community because, prison is a terrible place for somebody with a problem with drugs. We have more people actually taking up drugs in many prisons now than we have going in with drug problems because levels of boredom and frustration are so high. I mean, the government's own drug strategy talks about dampening the demand for drugs by just giving people meaningful things to do. And that's not the conditions that we see in prisons at the moment.
OK, thanks. That's not perhaps the most positive note to end things on, but our time is up. Thank you both for a very enlightening discussion. We end these podcasts by asking each of our guests, if you were Lord Chancellor, Minister of Justice, what one thing would you do in this case to support prisoners to stop offending on release? Andy, you go first.
I think we should revisit how we're doing interventions for people like my brother with mental health. Why is it that we're waiting until there's a crime being committed? The mental health interventions that we're delivering in the community, I think we're all aware when we're walking around our city centres, are not really effective, and those people should not be in prisons. And I think from my experience in prison, there are too many of those individuals in prisons. So I don't know what the answer is, but the community model of delivering mental health in communities isn't effective in my view. So I would look at that. Okay, thank you. Andrea, what about you?
I would do a proper review of sentencing.
Haven't we just had one of those?
No, I'm afraid we haven't. We had a kind of political deliverability review of sentencing that I think baked in a real aversion to any degree of radical change. But sentences for everything have more than doubled over the last 25 years. So we need to go back to having the sentences where they were, in line with where they are, frankly, in Northern Ireland and in Scotland for most offences and in Western Europe. So I would bring down life sentences again, back down to kind of 15-year starting point rather than, 25, 30-year starting points. And then, frankly, I would do an audit of all of the prisons and resentence everybody because I just think we need to empty out these jails. Nothing good can happen in them.
That's an ambitious agenda. Penelope, what would you do?
I mean, we're talking about rehabilitation, and I have to say I agree with everything people have said. And I would also say, if you're going to send them to prison, allow them to move on by reforming the criminal record system. So we punish them really badly, then we release them, and then we say, sorry, you've still got a life sentence, whatever your sentence was in the first place, because you're going to have to declare this forever and a day. So let's change that. Rob, what about you?
Well, I agree with all of these ideas. I think I've made this recommendation before. We're creating these now 14,000 new prison places. Surely some of that money should be being used for alternatives, whether they are the kind of mental health alternatives that Andy's talked about, stronger supervision in the community, better rehabilitation for people with drug dependency problems. To put it all into prisons seems to me the wrong thing to do. And at the same time, we need to turn our prisons into the kind of environments that can genuinely do rehabilitation, not just talk about it.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rob, Andrea and Andy. And for more information on the Howard League, on Andy's work and the Select Committee report, do look at our programme links. Bye from me.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye from me.